Well, recent political changes from Zimbabwe to Angola and right here in South Africa at home have sparked renewed optimism about investment in the continent. Will Africa be able to ride the wave of new technologies offered by the thinking around the fourth industrial revolution in order to rise again? Do we even need those technologies? Is it even about the technologies? I'm Bruce Whitfield. This is Taking Stock on ENCA, and I'm joined by the knowledge lead from the World Economic Forum's Fourth Industrial Revolution practice, Anne-Marie Engtoft-Larsen, and the political economist Siya Beneza. Siya, let's start with you. Broad continental overview. The consultants will tell us Africa presents the greatest opportunity in the last 50 years for companies around the world to capitalize on a demographic revolution of only the most positive and fruitful kind. That's one side of that particular coin. By 2030, we could have 1.4 billion people living on our continent and nobody in a better economic position than they are now. Those are two sides of exactly the same coin, surely.
Yes, I think that's really the challenge of, as well as that opposes the opportunity that Africa is facing. I think with a lot of investment that is taking place and that still needs to take place. I mean, the African Development Bank is trying to source around 111 trillion for infrastructure investment on the continent, and that's a real big opportunity for people involved in construction, etc. But I think we cannot really take advantage of the demographic dividend without creating opportunities for jobs, without even creating opportunities for entrepreneurship, which I think is more important than just creating jobs. So on the one hand, Africa does create opportunities, but the current socioeconomic and political conditions are easing, but the economic and socioeconomic conditions are still a major constraints. Incomes are very low, literacy rates are very low. A lot of the opportunity is then constrained as a result of this.
And we've seen technology coming to the fore quite nicely in many spheres, but on quite an elementary basis. The use in Kenya, for example, where the banking system isn't as evolved in South Africa, of mobile phones to transfer money was a great example. And people have put a huge amount of optimism on that one fact, that you see technology really enables better lives in Africa. And it does, but not perhaps in the way that the fairy tale books are telling us the fourth industrial revolution is going to do all the horrible jobs and we're all going to have more time to sit on the beach in future.
Look, I think for me this speaks to the way that Africa is integrated generally, in the international economy as well as global production networks generally. I think in as much as the world can pat itself on its back in terms of technological advancements and smartphones, etc., the things that are at the frontier aren't typically done or made for, African consumers. Whether you look at some of the top-end smartphones, which inevitably result in some conflict on the continent as a result of extraction of minerals in places like the DRC, etc. And so it seems as though despite all the innovation and technological advancement, the way in which Africa has been integrated and considered in this is typically neglected, and so we don't innovate for African consumers or the African, generally producers. And I think there was a try with, Southeast Asian movement around this, creating for the bottom of the pyramid. But I think in many cases it was very demeaning how it was done, and the technologies, weren't of high quality, as though, people who are poorer don't value quality. And so that is fizzled out. But I think, things that are at the frontier driving the fourth industrial revolution aren't integrating Africa because the innovators and the production networks don't take Africa into consideration.
Great point to bring you here, Anne-Marie. You work for the World Economic Forum. You're based in Geneva. And the World Economic Forum has been really big on the fourth industrial revolution. It was the theme of the Davos gathering 2016, I think it was. And absolutely central to this thinking around the fourth industrial revolution. It's almost as if this is the silver bullet to solve the world's problems.
It is definitely not the silver bullet to solve the world's problems. I think looking at the African continent, we see that industrial revolutions have been excluding more and more people. We still have 25% only that are able to use the internet. That's a prerequisite for even being part of the third industrial revolution. Half of the continent do not have access to electricity. That is a technology of the second industrial revolution. And I think it's up to 600 million smallholder farmers who still even haven't mechanized. This is the first industrial revolution. So the fourth industrial revolution in and of itself is not going to create change. Technologies in and of themselves are not going to create change. Political systems need to change. Politicians need to be far more courageous and bold. This is about socioeconomic change as well, and it's about taking that 3.5% growth that the continent is seeing now away from resource extraction and primary industries towards inclusive, sustainable growth that is also creating jobs, because the challenges and the concerns that we see a lot in the West about automation from robotics and AI are also going to be a huge challenge on the African continent.
And it's so refreshing to hear, because disciples of the Fourth Industrial Revolution movement will have you believe that the device that is in your pocket, this is going to solve the world's problems. It may address some of them. It may facilitate better transactions. It may enable people to communicate. And maybe one day there will be a surgeon in a remote area who will do life-saving heart surgery on a child that could never be done before. But that's not what is going to change the fundamental structure of economies across this continent.
Look, the drones example, I think, is an amazing technology that we're seeing being used in a very novel way in Rwanda, where drones are delivering blood. It is a whole new way of thinking about airspace and about basic service delivery. But it does not take away the need for a hospital every 100 kilometers. It does not take away the need for being able to transport people from A to B in ambulances. So I think we should not look at the technologies as a panacea. These are an opportunities, but that need requires businesses, it requires international investors, it requires governments, civil society leaders to come together and integrate them into a totally different way. I think also when we look at the African manufacturing sector, for the past decades, Africa has been deindustrializing. Being able to integrate emerging technologies require you to have a manufacturing base. We're not going to see people that can create huge businesses solely based on access to 3D printing. That requires a manufacturing path dependency, and it requires a trajectory of production. So I think we still need to look at some of those more classical pathways to development, while we're also looking at how can technology then become part of that, and how can that maybe speed up some of those processes. But at the same time, we also see a world around Africa where technologies are impacting at a scale and a scope and a pace that is unprecedented, disrupting industries that used to be part of a global value chain that Africa could speak into. Part of those value chains are completely being disruptive, and that's going to be a challenge as well.
That actually creates more problems than solutions for the African continent, yeah?
Yes, I think, but I think we are commendable in what we've been able to achieve, I think, because everywhere else you look, and I think the greatest achievement has been around the regional integration process. Whereas everywhere else you look, people get the economic basis for regional integration. Europe, for example, Southeast Asia, etc. But the biggest hurdle is the political will. And I think African leaders have shown that there's a political will, despite the limited economic base, for us to, to drive the integration process. And I think if Africa is able to disrupt these value chains, as we, have seen with the finance sector and how M-Pesa has disrupted, the finance sector throughout, and how people are looking at how to resolve issues of financial inclusion, etc. I think Africa is able to innovate, but the innovations then need to be grounded in our capacity and improving the capacity to produce, rather than relying on, raw mineral exports. But I think the current political economic structures on the continent are maintained by people who have a deep interest in them being so, cheaper minerals, etc., inputs to existing industrial capacity. And so this, fourth industrial revolution, and the way in which, as you mentioned, there's some African farmers who are still trying to get over the first industrial revolution of mechanizing agriculture, for example. It is also an indictment on people who have reached the fourth industrial revolution, leaving behind the continent. And it is about, what are you innovating for, and, similarly, and the global inequality discussion as, again, an indictment upon people who are right at the frontier of technological advancement, economic advancement, etc. And what is the purpose and the goal of the innovation? It cannot be, good in and of itself, as you say.
How much innovation is enough, and how much is too much, and how much actually causes greater dislocation than we have even right now? More with Anne-Marie Engtoft-Larsen and Sia Beniza after this break, taking stock on ENCA.